"I always knew he was cruel," she whispered, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as the room held its collective breath. "But I did not expect him to humiliate me while I was carrying his child." The Allegiant Hearts Gala was never just any ordinary event. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society, the precise intersection where high fashion met unimaginable fortune. It was a space where dark secrets sparkled dangerously under the warm glow of crystal champagne flutes, and where lifelong reputations could either rise to the heavens or burn to the ground in a single, unforgiving evening. Held annually at the breathtaking Armandi Grand Hall, it was a place where even the sweeping marble stairs seemed to judge you as you ascended them. The night promised unparalleled elegance, intense drama, and this year, a public scandal that absolutely no one in attendance would ever forget. Everyone who was anyone important was there. Tech CEOs, banking heirs, elite fashion editors, and powerful politicians operating in disguise mingled under the vaulted ceilings. Outside, the media swarmed the grand entrance, a chaotic sea of flashing bulbs and shouting reporters, all desperate to capture the highly anticipated arrival of Julien Duval, the city's most charismatic tech mogul, and the woman he was about to debut as his brand new fiancée. He certainly did not disappoint them. Julien stepped smoothly out of a pristine white Rolls-Royce, dressed impeccably in a custom midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. On his arm was Dahlia Fontaine, the reigning Miss Earth, a famous model, a viral influencer, and exactly 12 years younger than his ex-wife. Her dress was a shimmering silver sheath with a slit high enough to make every single camera lens instantly zoom in. Together, they looked exactly like a glossy magazine cover come to life, flawless, unattainable, and dangerously proud. As Julien and Dahlia made their way slowly down the red carpet, bathing in the adoration, cameras flashed like a violent lightning storm. Journalists shoved microphones over the velvet ropes, shouting rapid-fire questions. "Julien, how long have you two actually been together? Dahlia, when is the wedding taking place? Julien, will your ex-wife be attending the gala tonight?" Julien paused, flashing his signature, arrogant smirk at that last question. "I highly doubt she would show her face here," he replied smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. He had absolutely no realization that just yards away, waiting in the shadows of the courtyard, that very face was preparing to make the most talked-about entrance in gala history. Inside the magnificent ballroom, a live string orchestra played a beautiful, haunting melody, while guests whispered viciously behind their expensive champagne flutes. Some of the men discussed recent market shifts and startup acquisitions, while others swapped quiet gossip about whose wealth was failing or who had recently gotten bad Botox. But by 8 o'clock in the evening, the entire room was collectively focused on one specific couple. Julien and Dahlia were holding court near the massive floral sponsor wall, soaking in the admiration. "She is absolutely breathtaking," someone murmured admiringly from a nearby table. "Sure she is," another voice whispered back sharply. "But do you remember how he left Chloe? A week after their third failed IVF round." The high society gossip was incredibly cruel, but it was entirely accurate. 2 years ago, Julien Duval had coldly filed for divorce from his devoted wife of 5 years, Chloe Marin Duval. It happened less than a month after she tragically miscarried their long-awaited child. There was no heartfelt explanation, no tearful goodbye, just a sterile, legally approved PR statement released to the press about the couple growing apart. After that, Chloe simply vanished. There were no emotional Instagram posts, no tearful press interviews, no paparazzi sightings whatsoever. She slowly became a fading memory that the fast-paced media quickly moved past. She was viewed by the elite as a woman discarded the moment her fertility became inconvenient for a man who demanded perfection. Until now. At exactly 5 minutes past 8, the towering grand ballroom doors swung completely open. A sudden, heavy hush spread through the massive crowd like wildfire. There she was, Chloe. She walked into the room slowly, each step deliberate, grounded, and echoing with power. Her custom Dior black velvet gown hugged her curves perfectly and beautifully framed her very visible, undeniable baby bump. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly into a sleek, severe low bun. Her lips were painted a daring, unapologetic shade of red, and her eyes were locked straight ahead, unblinking and fearless. But that was not what made the entire room gasp in unison. It was the man walking right beside her. Gabriel Lancaster. He was a notorious billionaire, the enigmatic founder of Ascend Capital. This was the man who had once famously refused a high-profile 60-minute television interview because he found it boring, and who had not been seen in public with a romantic date in over 4 years. His presence alone in a boardroom could double a tech stock's value overnight. And right now, he was standing proudly beside Julian's discarded ex-wife, one large, strong hand resting protectively and intimately on the small of her back. Across the room, Julian froze mid-laugh. The crystal champagne glass slipped completely from his suddenly numb fingers and shattered violently onto the hard marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the sudden silence. Chloe did not even flinch at the sound. A brilliant photographer near the entrance, instantly realizing the monumental story unfolding in real time, snapped a rapid series of shots that would later crash fashion blogs, tech websites, and global gossip columns all at once. The image captured it all: Chloe, heavily pregnant, radiant, looking like an absolute queen with a billionaire holding her arm, and Julian completely out of focus in the background, wide-eyed, pale, and utterly stunned. Gasps rippled visibly through the crowd of elites. A wealthy socialite, standing near the center of the room, whispered frantically to her husband, "She actually came here with Gabriel Lancaster? Isn't he notoriously private?" "Yes," her husband whispered back, his eyes wide. "And he is worth more than Julian 3 times over." On the stage, the professional orchestra stumbled awkwardly over a note. Waiters paused mid-pour, champagne spilling slightly onto their silver trays. Even Dahlia turned to look at Julian, her practiced, pageant-ready smile completely fading as her panicked eyes darted back and forth between her wealthy fiancé and the elegant woman he had once left behind. Gabriel leaned in close, his lips brushing Chloe's ear, and whispered something quietly to her. She nodded, the painted corners of her lips lifting slightly, just enough to show absolute strength, not petty spite. Her sharp eyes never once left Julian's pale face. She was completely calm, but it was a terrifying, dangerous kind of calmness. Julian finally forced his feet to move, stepping awkwardly forward, with Dahlia still clinging desperately to his arm. "Chloe," he managed to say, his voice sounding far too loud and strained in the suddenly quiet, eavesdropping room. "This is highly unexpected." Chloe raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, looking at him as if he were a stranger. "Is it?" she asked softly. "You did not think I would be invited to my own charity's gala?" Dahlia blinked rapidly, clearly out of her depth and completely unprepared for a high-stakes social confrontation. Julian stammered, trying to regain his legendary composure. "I just meant that you have not been seen anywhere in public for 2 years." "I was healing," Chloe said, cutting him off smoothly with a voice like ice. She let a heavy pause hang in the air, then added pointedly, "And I was building." Gabriel's dark, intimidating eyes were locked entirely on Julian now, sharp, assessing, and completely unreadable. Julian shifted uncomfortably under the billionaire's gaze and tried to force a polite smile. "Well, congratulations are in order, I suppose. I did not realize you were expecting a child." "Neither did you when you walked out the door," Chloe replied effortlessly, her tone deadly quiet. The sheer tension in the air could be sliced with a crystal flute. Dahlia's tight grip on Julian's tuxedo sleeve visibly faltered. Having delivered her absolute checkmate, Chloe turned gracefully back to Gabriel. "Shall we go find our table?" "Of course," Gabriel said smoothly, offering her his arm with absolute reverence. As they walked away, parting the crowd like royalty, a woman standing near the press area whispered loudly enough for Julian to hear. "Julian just lost the PR war in under 60 seconds. Another executive muttered in agreement. She upgraded massively. The orchestra finally found its footing again, and the beautiful music resumed. But the entire mood of the gala had permanently shifted. Absolutely no one was talking about Julian's shiny new fiancée anymore. They were all talking about Chloe, about the mysterious baby bump, and about the elusive billionaire who had just walked into the gala with her looking as though she hung the moon and stars. Because in that single defining moment, Chloe Marin Duval was not just someone's tragic ex-wife anymore. She was the fascinating, powerful woman that every single guest suddenly wanted to know, wanted to interview, or wanted to desperately invest in. And Julian, standing amidst the shattered glass of his drink, realized far too late that the real, undeniable power in the room did not come from beauty pageant titles or loud tech empires. It came from quiet resilience. It came from reinvention. It came from the very woman he had callously thrown away, who was now reborn as the beautiful center of the storm. Long before the hungry tabloids dubbed her the comeback queen, and long before her striking image graced the glossy covers of Vanity Fair and Forbes magazine, Chloe Marin Duval was simply Chloe Marin Bennett. She was a quiet, soft-spoken girl, so easily overlooked that she might as well have been entirely invisible in a room full of loud power players. She was absolutely not born into wealth or privilege. She was born into pure survival. Her difficult childhood was stitched together in worn second-hand clothes and cheap Friday night freezer meals in a very small, forgotten Oklahoma town. It was a place where expressing big ambition was considered arrogant, and where grand dreams were immediately handed a permanent waiting list. Her hard-working father had worked grueling double shifts at a local steel plant until a catastrophic workplace accident left him permanently paralyzed. Her devoted mother tirelessly cleaned houses for the wealthy and pinched their pennies so tightly they practically squealed. From a very young age, Chloe learned the harsh realities of the world. She learned exactly how to stretch a single dollar, how to hold her breath and endure when life got incredibly hard, and how to smile and pretend everything was perfectly fine even when her world was collapsing. But she also learned how to study relentlessly, and she learned how to fight. She fought quietly and fiercely, the exact way strong women do when they know no one else is watching or coming to save them. By the time she turned 17, her flawless academic record had earned her a full-ride scholarship to Northwestern University. She packed her entire modest life into one battered suitcase and boarded a miserable Greyhound bus to Chicago with exactly $62 in her pocket. As she watched her small town fade away in the rearview mirror, she made a solemn promise to herself. She would never, ever allow herself to be small again. At Northwestern, Chloe was an unstoppable force. She double-majored in complex economics and minored heavily in strategic communications. To survive financially, she worked 3 exhausting jobs. She was an early morning campus library assistant, a weekend barista dealing with rude customers, and a late-night freelance copy editor. What she severely lacked in elite family connections, she easily made up for in relentless, grinding discipline. She stayed awake reading dense business case studies at midnight. She studied corporate boardroom psychology like it was a holy gospel, and she taught herself exactly how to walk into any intimidating room acting like she absolutely belonged there, even when her worn-out shoes were bought from Payless. It was during the chaotic spring of her senior year that she first met Julian Duval. He was already aggressively making local headlines for a disruptive mobile startup he had launched out of his messy dorm room. He was charming, incredibly disarming, and wildly arrogant in that highly intoxicating way that certain men are when they know the entire room will applaud absolutely anything they say. Most of the girls on campus wanted him desperately. Chloe did not. Instead, she sat back and she watched him. She studied his methods, his flaws, his blind spots. And then, she publicly challenged him during a crowded Q&A session at a university tech panel. "You are up there selling the concept of disruption," she had said clearly from the very back row, her voice carrying over the crowd. "But looking at your user metrics, you are actually just marketing severe psychological dependency. Isn't that just rebranded corporate exploitation?" Julian blinked, completely caught off guard by her sharp intellect. Then a slow, fascinated smile spread across his face. That very night, he used his connections to track her down at a small, off-campus bookstore cafe and confidently asked her out. She looked up from her textbook and calmly said no. He returned the exact same time the next day, bringing her favorite iced caramel tea and a dog-eared, highlighted copy of the Lean Startup, completely scribbled with his own post-it notes, asking for her thoughts. They sat at a small wooden table and talked passionately about economics and the future for 6 straight hours. By the time spring bloomed, they were entirely inseparable. Julian fondly called her his secret brain trust. Chloe saw something special in him. She saw the exact kind of raw, chaotic potential that desperately needed a guiding direction. While he frantically built mobile apps and pitched wildly to venture capitalists, she was the steady hand behind the curtain. She helped him brilliantly refine his personal brand. She sharply shaped his investor language to maximize funding. And she expertly mapped out his long-term corporate scale strategy. When he finally sold his very first software company at the young age of 26 for $22 million, he proposed to her. It was not done with a flashy, gigantic ring or any loud public fanfare. He did it intimately in their cramped, messy studio apartment over boxes of cold Chinese takeout. He held her hands, looking into her eyes, whispering, "You have been the entire reason all of this actually works. I want us to build something even bigger together." She wept and said yes. They married a year later in a beautiful, understated rooftop ceremony, entirely surrounded by fellow tech founders, angel investors, and future Silicon Valley unicorns. The financial press loved them, dubbing them the next Elon Musk and Grimes, but without all the weirdness. Chloe secretly hated the reductive label, but she smiled brightly for the cameras anyway. She genuinely did not care about the flashing headlines. She only cared about building a life, about profound love, and about leaving a lasting legacy. But what absolutely no one saw coming, and what Chloe desperately tried not to admit even to herself in the dark of night, was exactly how quickly things started to fundamentally shift between them. As Julian's fame and net worth grew exponentially, so did his fragile, demanding ego. The sweet man who once affectionately kissed her forehead before every stressful pitch began taking highly secretive meetings that she was explicitly not invited to. He abruptly stopped asking for her brilliant opinions on new product launches. He started replacing her quiet wisdom by hiring flashy PR advisors who looked like runway models and spoke only in empty, trendy sound bites. At first, Chloe generously thought it was just the immense stress of running an empire. Then came the devastating, heartbreaking failed pregnancies. 3 catastrophic losses in 4 agonizing years. Each physical loss chipped away violently at her soul like a silent, relentless erosion. Julian was highly supportive at first. He was kind, holding her hand, consoling her in the hospital. But after the horrific trauma of the 3rd miscarriage, something fundamental inside him turned completely cold and distant. "You really need to stop letting this biological failure define your entire personality," he said callously one night, standing in the doorway after she had spent hours crying uncontrollably on the cold bathroom tiles. "You're supposed to be stronger than this, Chloe. We have a massive, global company to run." After that night, they stopped trying for a family. Worse, they completely stopped talking. By their 5th wedding anniversary, they were practically strangers, sharing an expensive silence in a sprawling glass penthouse overlooking a glittering city that absolutely no longer felt like a warm home. And then, without any warning, he left her. There was no explosive fight, no tearful explanation, no attempt at counseling. Just a cold, legally binding text message sent from his high-powered lawyer, followed immediately by a carefully worded, soulless press release sent to the media. "We have mutually decided to part ways amicably. We remain highly supportive of one another's future ventures." Supportive. The word made her sick. Chloe had literally built half of those multi-million-dollar ventures with her own mind. She had willingly stayed hidden in the dark shadows just so his fragile ego could shine brightly in the sun. She had sacrificed her failing body, her precious time, and her very name for his dreams. And he had callously replaced her with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. The dark weeks that immediately followed the divorce announcement were a terrifying blur of profound grief and crippling insomnia. Aggressive paparazzi swarmed her apartment building. Wealthy people she thought were her friends suddenly disappeared, taking Julian's side. Her aching body still painfully carried the heavy hormonal remnants of a pregnancy lost far too soon. And her email inbox flooded daily with cruel Google alerts about Julian's new luxury watch line and the young supermodel he was currently mentoring. So Chloe did the only thing she could do to survive. She vanished. She packed her bags, left Los Angeles behind, completely deleted every trace of her social media existence, and moved quietly to a secluded, rustic villa in Tuscany where absolutely no one knew her face and no one asked intrusive questions. Surrounded by rolling hills, she wrote endlessly in journals. She meditated in the sun. She planted fragrant lavender in the garden and read thick books under the shade of ancient olive trees. Slowly, painfully, day by day, she stitched her shattered heart back together. And then, while she was healing, something utterly miraculous happened in her body. She got pregnant. There were no stressful IVF treatments, no sterile fertility clinics, no crying over negative tests. Just pure, undeniable life happening naturally when she had finally stopped expecting it. She returned to the United States in her second trimester, completely transformed. She was fiercely determined to rebuild an empire, not just for herself anymore, but to ensure an unbreakable legacy for her unborn child. She started taking consulting jobs again, working quietly, anonymously, and highly strategically. One of her very first, highly confidential clients was Gabriel Lancaster. They had met purely by chance at an exclusive, invite-only private equity dinner in New York. He had previously read one of her anonymous, brilliantly written economic briefs and had asked his team to track down the author for a meeting. What started strictly as a highly lucrative business partnership evolved very slowly, and incredibly respectfully, into something so much deeper and more profound. Gabriel was not loud like Julian. He didn't constantly need to flaunt his wealth or his intellect. He simply listened intently, he protected fiercely, and he understood her completely. And he never, ever, not even once, asked her to shrink herself to make him feel taller. By the time the prestigious Allegiant Hearts Gala arrived on the calendar, Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just showing up to a party for champagne. She was publicly announcing her triumphant return to the world. She was returning not as Julian Duval's discarded tragic ex-wife, but as Chloe Marin Duval, an unstoppable future mother, a genius economic strategist, and an equal partner to one of the most powerful, respected men in the entire country. She was the woman no one had seen coming, and she was the woman no one would ever be able to ignore again. The Armandi Grand Hall was never just a simple event space. It was a towering, architectural monument to historical excess. It had originally been built as a 19th-century opera house where scandalous European royals came to secretly escape political revolution. But now, having been entirely reimagined by the ruthless billionaire developer Alina Vaselv, and dripping heavily in gold-trimmed, sleek modernity, it had easily become Manhattan's most elite, impenetrable venue. It was a place where high-stakes politics flirted shamelessly with high fashion, and where massive family fortunes were casually made or brutally ruined in the span of a single, whispered conversation. Tonight, the Allegiant Hearts Gala had beautifully transformed the Grand Hall into a literal temple of opulence. 10-foot, glittering crystal chandeliers hung heavily like frozen, illuminated waterfalls from arched ceilings painted in a soft, glowing ivory. The intoxicating, bespoke scent of crushed white roses and rich sandalwood lingered in the warm air, having been blended carefully and specifically for the evening by a master perfumer flown in privately from Paris. Attractive waiters dressed in impeccably tailored Armani uniforms glided seamlessly across the polished marble floors, expertly balancing delicate flutes of vintage Dom Perignon and heavy silver trays loaded with truffle-blended hors d'oeuvres. There were absolutely no normal, everyday people allowed inside here. There were no random plus ones who weren't at least minor, verified nobility in some obscure social sense. You did not simply buy a ticket and get invited to this room. You got heavily vetted and selected. And if you were photographed being seen here, you didn't just exist in society. You mattered. This was the exact room where Chloe Marin Duval had once walked silently, a step behind Julian, acting merely as a pretty accessory to his massive ego. Now she was about to walk through those doors and command the room as the main event. Earlier that evening, the packed ballroom had buzzed loudly with the highly predictable displays of excessive wealth. Ruthless hedge fund kings stood by the bar loudly comparing the length of their mega-yachts. Sleek venture capitalists bragged endlessly about their recent crypto market rebounds. Powerful media moguls stood in circles trading vicious gossip about a fallen A-list actress who had recently gone broke and turned to spiritual retreats. Everyone sipped their expensive champagne and smiled with painfully white teeth while constantly, nervously watching each other from behind the safety of their crystal flutes. Right in the dead center of it all stood Julian Duval, positively glowing with the toxic confidence of a man who firmly believed he had already won the game of life. He was dressed flawlessly in a custom-made, perfectly fitted tuxedo imported from Seville Row, his dark hair trimmed to precise, calculated imperfection. Clinging tightly to his arm, as absolutely everyone in the room already knew, was Dahlia Fontaine. She was 25 years old, physically flawless, and looked like a walking, talking advertisement for expensive cosmetic symmetry. She was exactly the kind of woman who didn't walk into a room so much as she seemed to float above the floor. Miss Earth 2024, someone whispered snidely from behind a heavily sequined designer clutch. It still totally feels like a calculated PR stunt to fix his image. Julian heard the whispers, and he simply didn't care. Tonight was entirely about aggressive image control and public redemption. 2 years ago, when the messy divorce drama had slowly unfolded in the press, he had taken a significant professional hit. His company's stock price had dipped dangerously, there had been widespread investor uncertainty, and he had endured months of awkward, judgmental boardroom glances. But he had rebounded spectacularly, publicly at least. And tonight, standing proudly beside a gorgeous beauty queen in the city's most exclusive, impenetrable gala, he truly believed the media narrative was entirely his to control again. Until the heavy brass doors opened. Chloe walked in, and she arrived not with a quiet, polite whisper, but with a massive, crushing wave of absolute silence. The crowded ballroom didn't just gasp. It held its collective breath in pure shock. She had timed her arrival perfectly, acting as if she had scientifically studied the exact rhythm of the room. She had waited patiently in the wings for the orchestra music to soften, for the hungry media cameras to focus entirely on Julian's face, and then, boom, the entrance. Her gown was a breathtaking custom, Dior black velvet masterpiece with a plunging, architectural neckline that framed her delicate collarbones like a priceless sculpture. A stunning, priceless vintage diamond bracelet shimmered subtly at her slender wrist. It was discreet, but financially devastating to anyone who knew gems. Her baby bump, which was about 5 months along now, was highly visible, but it was styled intentionally like a glorious centerpiece. She looked incredibly powerful, utterly undeniable, and fiercely proud. Walking closely beside her, Gabriel Lancaster looked like raw, unadulterated power dressed in expensive human skin. His dark charcoal tuxedo was minimalist, sharp, and specifically designed to say one clear thing to the room: I do not need to impress a single one of you. I have already won. The elite crowd didn't even dare to whisper at first. They just stared in open-mouthed shock, because absolutely nothing screamed high society scandal quite like a notoriously private billionaire sponsor turned fiercely protective romantic partner. From the far corner of the room, the gala's wealthy host, a notoriously sharp-tongued socialite named Morgan Delort, nearly dropped her glass of expensive wine onto her shoes. Is that actually Chloe Duval? She hissed to her companion. Someone beside her confirmed it rapidly. And she is with Gabriel Lancaster. Together. Oh my God. Julian is going to absolutely choke on his own ego. Across the sprawling room, Julian's carefully constructed, smug expression cracked violently, if only for an agonizing second. He tried desperately to play it cool. He lifted his replacement glass of champagne to his lips. He forced a tight smile, but his terrified eyes didn't blink. He stood frozen and watched as Chloe and Gabriel made their slow, regal way toward the main stage, heading directly for the VIP section where the evening's biggest, most important donors were currently gathering. Dahlia felt the massive shift in energy immediately. "Julian," she whispered urgently, tugging hard on his tuxedo sleeve. "Are you okay? You look sick." He nodded his head once. A little too quickly. "She's just trying to stir up cheap drama for the cameras," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Just ignore it. Keep smiling." But absolutely no one in the room was ignoring it. Not the flashing press cameras, not his influential board members, and certainly not the wealthy women who had once smiled politely and condescendingly at Chloe, who now rushed forward to greet her exactly like she was returning royalty. "Chloe, darling, you look absolutely radiant. My God, who is your new stylist? The dress is incredible. Congratulations on the beautiful baby." She thanked every single one of them with effortless grace, her confident smile never once faltering. When one particularly bold and nosy socialite dared to ask who the father of the baby was, Chloe simply smiled a radiant, mysterious smile and placed a hand on her stomach. "I am incredibly blessed. That is absolutely all that matters tonight." Gabriel said nothing to the prying crowd. He didn't need to utter a single word. His imposing, protective mere presence standing at her shoulder did all the talking necessary. As the glittering gala continued into the night, the room's attention had entirely shifted. No one cared about the charitable cause of the night anymore, nor did they care about Julian's tech empire. Every eye was directed toward Chloe's stunning reappearance, her breathtaking elegance, her powerful silence, and her undeniable strength. At exactly 9:15, the lavish, multi-course dinner was finally served to the tables. It featured decadent gold leaf risotto, delicate microgreens flown in privately from Kyoto that morning, and perfectly dry-aged filet mignon. Julian desperately tried to engage in business talk with his wealthy donors at his table. But every single conversation inevitably ended with someone asking, "Did you see Chloe's entrance?" He clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. He had spent an absolute fortune over the last 2 years carefully crafting his untouchable image, only for it to completely crumble into dust in under 5 minutes because of a woman he had once callously dismissed as being far too soft to ever survive corporate PR warfare. But here she was not just surviving, but thriving beautifully. Gabriel leaned intimately into Chloe between the luxurious dinner courses. "Would you like to leave now?" he asked her gently, his low voice for her ears only. She glanced around the room, noticing the dozens of camera lenses still eagerly watching their every move. "No," she said, her eyes flashing with quiet victory. "Let's stay just a little bit longer. I am thoroughly enjoying the show." Near the extravagant dessert bar across the room, Dahlia stood waiting for a macaroon when she overheard someone whisper loudly, "She is absolutely glowing tonight. And bringing that man, Gabriel Lancaster, that is definitely not just a sad rebound. That is a massive, calculated statement of power." Dahlia's throat tightened with sudden, suffocating insecurity. She marched back to their table and turned angrily to Julian. "You specifically told me she would not be here tonight. I honestly didn't think she would ever have the nerve to show up." He hissed defensively, looking around to see who was listening. "She's highly pregnant, Julian. I can clearly see that. And she is standing here with Gabriel Lancaster." I said, "I see it," Julian snapped, losing his temper. Dahlia blinked in shock. her flawless mask of pageant confidence completely slipping off. "Do you still have romantic feelings for her?" Julian stared down blankly at his untouched, expensive wine. "I honestly didn't know I did," he said very quietly, almost to himself. "Until right now." Dahlia stepped back as if she had been slapped, and for the very first time that night, she realized something truly terrifying about her life. She wasn't the beloved main character in this glamorous story. She was just a disposable plot device. Chloe wasn't just back in society, she was actively winning the war. Julian Duval had always, fundamentally believed he was completely untouchable. From the very moment he built his highly successful first tech company in a grimy, unheated Chicago basement, Julian had operated under one ruthless, unwavering principle: win at absolutely all costs. He didn't just want to be enormously rich. He deeply wanted to be admired by the masses, envied by his peers, and feared by his enemies. And for a very long time, he was successfully all three. He was exactly the kind of arrogant man who effortlessly turned boring corporate IPOs into massive, flashy personal victory laps. His trademark confidence wasn't just highly visible, it was weaponized against anyone who doubted him. His firm handshake aggressively closed impossible deals. His condescending smirk made seasoned competitors flinch and back down in negotiations. And his name, it wasn't just a name anymore. It was a globally recognized, highly profitable brand. At the young age of 32, he was already proudly featured on the glossy cover of Forbes magazine. The media admiringly called him the undisputed kingmaker of Silicon Avenue. At 33, he was happily marrying Chloe Marin Bennett, the brilliant, humble, incredibly grounded woman he publicly claimed kept him tethered to reality. But being grounded in reality wasn't what Julian truly craved deep down in his soul. He didn't want an anchor, he wanted explosive launch pads to propel him higher into the stratosphere. In the early, happy years of their relationship, he cleverly hid his growing arrogance behind a thick veil of affection. He thoughtfully bought Chloe expensive flowers after grueling investor meetings, lovingly told her she was his saving grace and his anchor, and heavily praised her unmatched economic insight during their late-night strategy sessions. Behind closed, locked doors, he listened to her brilliant ideas intently. But publicly, in front of the press and the board, he happily, selfishly took all the credit for her genius. She genuinely didn't mind it at first. Chloe wasn't ever greedy for the glaring spotlight. She deeply believed in him, she supported his wild vision, and she foolishly trusted that her fierce, unwavering loyalty would always be enough to sustain his love. But Julian was rapidly evolving into something monstrous. The more wildly successful and famous he became, the less he saw Chloe as his equal partner, and the more he viewed her like a quiet, outdated piece of background decor. She was incredibly smart, sure, but she wasn't loud enough for his new life. She wasn't sharply aggressive enough for flashy press events. And she wasn't brand forward or trendy enough for his rapidly growing, highly manicured public image. "She's just way too soft for this world," he had once callously told a ruthless colleague after Chloe had quietly, politely exited a chaotic, drug-fueled product launch party early. "We desperately need someone on my arm who actually knows how to aggressively own a room." That was the exact moment when the emotional distance between them began to grow into a vast chasm. He started exclusively inviting slick publicists, vapid social media influencers, and rising, hungry fashion models to the exact same intimate corporate dinners Chloe used to always attend as his right hand. Slowly, methodically, she was entirely edited out of his professional and public life. When she tragically miscarried their third, desperately wanted child, Julian didn't even bother to cancel his highly publicized business trip to the Davos summit. "She just really needs some quiet space right now," he coldly told his concerned assistant while packing his expensive suits. "I'm honestly not very helpful to be around when she gets overly emotional like this." He sent a massive, impersonal arrangement of white flowers to the hospital room and didn't even bother to call her that night. He constantly rationalized all of his terrible behavior to himself. He convinced his ego that he wasn't being cruel to his grieving wife. He was simply being hyper-focused on changing the world. True, historical visionaries simply didn't slow down their momentum for minor personal setbacks. They ruthlessly pushed forward. When he finally filed the cruel divorce papers, Julian didn't shed a single tear. He didn't hesitate for a second before signing his name. "She will be totally fine," he had said dismissively to his team of high-priced legal sharks. "She is a strong girl. She will easily land on her feet somewhere else." What he absolutely didn't want to admit to his lawyers, and what even he hadn't fully psychologically processed yet, was the terrifying fact that Chloe had completely seen through his fake facade in a profound way no one else on earth ever had. She knew his weaknesses. She knew his insecurities. And that deep, intimate knowledge terrified him to his core. So like a coward, he cut the cord abruptly before she could hold a mirror up to his blind, raging ambition and force him to look at the monster he had become. He fully expected her to emotionally spiral out of control, to publicly beg for his attention, and eventually to just fade away into miserable obscurity. Instead, she had simply vanished. There was no messy public drama, no juicy tabloid scandal, just complete, maddening silence. Julian, however, moved on very publicly and very loudly anyway. His very next girlfriend was a bubbly, 24-year-old interior designer who only managed to last 6 exhausting months. The one immediately after that was a fiery Brazilian soap actress whose English vocabulary seemingly peaked at the word baby. And yes, they all came and went in a blur. They were all very pretty, very shiny, and ultimately very temporary. And then came Dahlia Fontaine. She was absolutely, mathematically perfect on paper. A crowned beauty queen, frequent, glamorous TV appearances, and a staggeringly huge, devoted Instagram following. She made Julian feel incredibly powerful and relevant again. People constantly noticed them when they walked into a restaurant. They were always photographed together looking rich and flawless. He really liked that attention. He liked the adoring way she looked up at him as if he were a god. And he especially liked the envious way other men looked at them. He truly thought he was securely back on the very top of the world. Until the fateful night of the gala. Until Chloe had confidently walked in, heavily pregnant, holding the arm of Gabriel Lancaster. It was the very first time in years that Julian truly, deeply felt like he had been utterly outmaneuvered on the chessboard of life. It wasn't just because Gabriel had significantly more money and influence than he did. It wasn't just because Chloe looked infinitely more beautiful and radiant than he had ever remembered her being. It was entirely because she didn't look at him like she needed a single thing from him anymore. Not revenge, not emotional closure, not even basic human acknowledgement. That total, freezing indifference was absolutely devastating to his massive ego. Suddenly, standing in his expensive tuxedo, Julian felt completely, terribly exposed to the world. He thought back rapidly to all the terrible times he had purposely minimized her worth. How he had cruelly told their mutual friends she just wasn't mentally built for the stress of big business. How he had constantly, pettily criticized her for not dressing the fashionable part of a billionaire's wife. How he had once brutally mocked her for crying tears of frustration after a failed investor pitch, telling her coldly, "You are not made of fragile glass, Chloe. Stop pretending to be a victim." Now, standing in the ballroom, the only fragile, broken thing in the room was him. Dahlia, possessing the sharp instincts of a woman fighting for her status, sensed the massive, tectonic shift in his demeanor. In the silent, tense car ride home after the gala, she furiously confronted him. "You are still completely in love with her." Julian didn't even try to deny the accusation. He just stared blankly out the tinted window, watched the bright city lights blur into streaks, and muttered softly, "I don't even know what I am feeling anymore." "You foolishly lost her," Dahlia said flatly, her voice dripping with disgust. "And now, she is the one winning the game." He didn't respond to her, because deep down in his hollow chest, he knew she was absolutely right. for the very first time in Julien Duval's heavily scripted life. He wasn't in total control of the narrative story. He was the pathetic subject of the story. He was just the foolish ex-husband who arrogantly left his brilliant wife and got effortlessly replaced by a much better, wealthier man. The foolish man who stupidly traded profound brilliance for shallow beauty and got thoroughly outclassed on absolutely every conceivable level. And now, the entire world was eagerly watching his downfall. Chloe had fully expected the cruel whispers, and she had braced herself for the stolen, judgmental glances. But she hadn't fully expected this level of icy exclusion. The exact moment she confidently stepped away from the crowded main hall and crossed the threshold into the intimate, highly exclusive sponsors' lounge, where the highest-tier donors mingled privately behind thick velvet ropes and drank custom-crafted cocktails, the room's temperature seemed to drop instantly. Not literally, but socially, as if an invisible hand had suddenly dimmed the spotlight on her presence. Curious, judgmental eyes flicked toward her, fake smiles instantly tightened into grimaces, and loud, booming conversations suddenly paused awkwardly mid-sentence, only to resume a moment later in incredibly careful, hushed, stilted tones. Gabriel, always hyper-observant, noticed the hostile shift in the room's energy instantly. He calmly placed a warm, steadying hand on the small of her back. "They're incredibly uncomfortable with your power," he murmured softly in her ear. Chloe nodded slowly, her chin held high. "Let them be uncomfortable." But just as they moved gracefully toward the glowing, ice-sculpted champagne bar to order a drink, someone intentionally blocked their path. Dahlia Fontaine. She stood there blocking the aisle, looking radiant but aggressive in a champagne gold designer gown that shimmered under the lights like morning frost. Her facial expression was heavily poised for the cameras, but right behind the practiced poise was something incredibly cold, sharp, and maliciously calculating. "Oh," Dahlia said loudly, sporting a fake, overly sweet smile. "You must be the famous Chloe." Chloe didn't take the bait. She gave her a slow, polite, completely dismissive nod. "Dahlia." Julien, trailing nervously just a few steps behind his furious fiancée, looked as though he had aged 10 agonizing years in the past 10 stressful minutes. He wisely kept his physical distance from the two women, but he didn't dare to interrupt the brewing storm. He didn't have to say a word, because Dahlia already had a captive audience forming. People in the exclusive lounge had begun to gather subtly around them, pretending to sip their expensive drinks or casually admire the charity sponsor board, while clearly, eagerly watching the tense interaction unfold. The heavy energy in the lounge crackled like electricity, as everyone present sensed a massive, dramatic scene was about to violently erupt. Dahlia's voice was thick and syrupy, almost too aggressively controlled. "I just wanted to come over and say, you look incredibly brave tonight. It is certainly not easy showing up to an elite event like this in your heavy condition, especially while squeezing into such a tightly fitted dress." Chloe kept her piercing gaze perfectly steady, not letting the body-shaming insult land. "Creating a human life isn't something to be shameful of hiding, Dahlia. And the design house of Dior clearly seems to agree with me." A few heads in the gathered crowd turned to hide their amusement. A quiet, appreciative chuckle actually slipped from somewhere deep in the crowd of listeners. But Dahlia wasn't nearly finished trying to draw blood. "Of course, I suppose it certainly helps to have massive support in your life. Both emotional and incredibly financial," she said venomously, casting a highly pointed, disrespectful glance up at Gabriel. "Though personally, I've always firmly believed that a real modern woman should be able to stand on her own 2 feet without a man's wallet." Chloe tilted her head slightly, a deadly, calm smile forming on her red lips. "You mean standing on your own 2 feet, like successfully earning your pageant title by parading around in front of 6 old male judges, instead of just begging for likes from thousands of anonymous teenage users on TikTok?" A much sharper, louder laugh erupted this time from a senior fashion magazine editor, sipping a gin martini nearby. Dahlia's pale face flushed a furious, mottled red, but she desperately forced herself to keep smiling through the absolute humiliation. Julian finally stepped forward, panicking at the escalating disaster. "All right, Dahlia. That is enough. Let's go." But it was far too late to stop the train crash. The dramatic scene had already been firmly set. Dahlia completely dropped her fake, sweet smile, her shrill voice growing much louder now for the audience to hear. "I'm just openly saying what everyone here is thinking. It's a little too incredibly convenient, don't you think? You completely disappear from society for 2 years, come crawling back pregnant, and suddenly you are clinging to the arm of a billionaire who could literally buy this entire building with his pocket change. That's not a glow-up, Chloe. That's just a desperate, calculated financial strategy." Dead, horrifying silence fell over the lounge. Cameras didn't openly flash, but you could physically feel the presence of dozens of cell phones recording the meltdown discreetly from behind purses. This wasn't just high society drama anymore. This was a brutal, public spectacle. Chloe's heart pounded fiercely in her chest, not from fear of the girl, but from something much deeper and darker. An unspoken, sacred line of decency had just been aggressively crossed. She took a slow, deep breath, centering her power. "Convenient?" she said, her voice remaining terrifyingly deadly calm. "You mean convenient like suddenly being crowned Miss Earth purely thanks to a lucrative corporate brand deal that your sleazy manager slept with a judge for?" If the room had gasped before, this time Dahlia went completely, sickly pale, looking as if she might faint. Julian stiffened as if he had been physically struck. Gabriel finally stepped forward now, not to verbally defend Chloe, because she clearly didn't need it, but to stand physically beside her as an imposing, silent, unshaken wall of pure intimidation. "I really didn't come here tonight to fight with a child," Chloe continued, her voice low, dangerous, but incredibly firm, making sure every word echoed. "But let's be absolutely crystal clear. You can proudly flaunt your shiny new ring and your bought title. You can show off your borrowed gown and your expensive Botox. But what you absolutely cannot fake in this world is true substance or actual class. And judging heavily by the pathetic fact that you are currently standing here, shaking and feeling threatened by a pregnant woman wearing flat shoes, well, if I were you, I would be incredibly worried about my future too." With that devastating final blow, Chloe turned gracefully on her heel and walked away. Gabriel followed her lead without uttering a single word to the stunned couple. But just before the heavy mahogany lounge doors swung firmly shut behind them, Dahlia's voice rose one last time in the silent room. Desperate, shrill, pathetic. "At least I didn't try to trap a wealthy man with a baby," she screamed. That was the absolute breaking point. Julian spun around violently, grabbing her arm. "Dahlia, shut your mouth." "No," she snapped wildly, violently yanking her arm away and stepping forward toward the crowd. "Let's talk about the truth. She shows up here acting like some majestic phoenix, pregnant, glamorous, completely unbothered, and we're all just supposed to magically forget what happened between you two." "She didn't trap anyone," Julian roared through tightly gritted teeth, his face purple with rage. "And if anyone should be deeply, profoundly embarrassed to be in this room right now, it is you." The entire crowd froze in absolute shock. Dahlia's furious face completely collapsed into a mask of pure devastation. "You're actually standing here defending her over me?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm begging you to stop publicly humiliating yourself and my company," Julian hissed venomously. Dahlia stared at him in utter disbelief. Then she turned her tear-filled eyes to the surrounding crowd, who were now openly staring at her with a brutal, suffocating mix of pathetic pity and extreme discomfort. She tried desperately to laugh the tension off, tried shakily to fix her perfect hair. but the catastrophic social damage was already permanently done. Meanwhile, out in the quiet, carpeted hallway, Chloe stood waiting by the brass elevator doors, her hands trembling ever so slightly from the massive adrenaline dump. Gabriel leaned in close, shielding her from view. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, closing her eyes. "Please, let's just leave now." They stepped into the elevator and exited together into the cool, dark night, stepping out into a glittering city that suddenly, undeniably felt exactly like it was hers again. Back inside the suffocating ballroom, absolutely no one was paying attention to Julian or his weeping fiancée anymore. The media cameras and the whispers had already eagerly followed Chloe out the door. The heavy brass elevator doors closed with a soft, musical chime, permanently shutting out the chaotic, buzzing noise of the gala behind them. Chloe immediately pressed her back heavily against the cold, mirrored wall of the cabin and finally exhaled. It was a shaky, shallow, ragged breath, exactly like she had been painfully holding her breath underwater for the entire night. Her sensible designer flats wobbled unsteadily beneath her feet, even though they were highly practical by torturous red carpet standards. Her hands trembled uncontrollably against her velvet dress. She suddenly, overwhelmingly wanted to cry, to scream until her throat bled, or just curl up into a tiny ball into herself and completely disappear from the world. But she did absolutely none of those things. Not yet. She couldn't. Gabriel stood patiently beside her in the small space in absolute, comforting silence. He was deeply respectful as always, giving her room to breathe, but his dark, intelligent eyes were incredibly sharp with genuine concern for her well-being. "You were absolutely incredible back there," he said quietly, his voice a low, soothing rumble in the enclosed space. Chloe nodded weakly, forcing a brave, exhausted smile. "Thank you." But deep down inside, she wasn't feeling particularly proud. She wasn't feeling gracefully composed. She was actively unraveling at the seams. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping to the underground VIP valet level. Gabriel's personal, trusted driver stood at attention waiting patiently beside the sleek, armored black Maybach. The damp, concrete chill of the underground garage wrapped around Chloe like a dark, physical warning. The silence between them wasn't comforting anymore. It was growing deafening. They climbed silently into the luxurious, leather-scented back seat, and as the heavy, soundproof doors shut firmly, sealing them inside, she finally exhaled for real. And then the dam broke. The tears finally came, silent, hot, and utterly relentless. She didn't heave or sob loudly. She just sat rigidly in her seat, staring blankly out the deeply tinted window into the darkness. Thick tears streaming continuously down her pale cheeks while the bright, neon city lights blurred past in glowing, colorful streaks. The towering, majestic buildings she had once admired with Julian now just looked like cold, inescapable glass cages. The busy, bustling streets that were once so deeply familiar to her suddenly felt entirely hostile and terrifying. Gabriel reached out slowly across the wide seat, offering his large, warm hand for comfort. She flinched instinctively, pulling away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered brokenly, swiping furiously at her wet cheeks. I really need a minute alone." He nodded understandingly, letting his hand drop instantly without a trace of offense. "Take all the time you need." When the smooth car finally arrived at the secure entrance of her towering building, Chloe practically climbed out of the door before the driver could even walk around to open it for her. The cheerful, uniformed night doorman greeted her politely at the desk, but she barely even registered his voice as she rushed past. She stepped quickly into the private, secure elevator of her penthouse residence, which was technically one of Gabriel's many hidden corporate real estate properties, and mindlessly watched the digital floor numbers climb higher and higher into the sky. When the doors finally opened, the massive, sprawling space greeted her in absolute, pristine silence. 20-foot-high ceilings, gleaming white marble floors, a breathtaking vintage baby grand piano sitting in the corner. It was a monument to extreme luxury, top-tier security, and profound, crushing isolation. Chloe walked straight past the gorgeous view of the skyline, straight into the cavernous, spa-like master bathroom, and stood staring intensely at herself in the massive, lit mirror. Her professional makeup was still absolutely flawless, having been heavily set by a makeup artist to successfully survive intense HD paparazzi cameras and harsh artificial lighting. Her sleek, severe hair was completely intact. Her expensive, custom velvet gown still clung perfectly and powerfully to her pregnant body. She looked incredibly, undeniably powerful to the outside world. But inside her chest, she felt exactly like a terrified, helpless child. She violently pulled off her heavy diamond earrings, tossing them carelessly onto the marble counter with a sharp clatter, and then slowly sank down onto the cold tile floor. Her shaking hands instinctively cradled her swollen stomach, rubbing it protectively. "I am so sorry," she whispered into the empty, echoing room, talking directly to her unborn baby. "I didn't mean for tonight to go exactly like that. I didn't want the yelling." The gala had undeniably been a massive, strategic success in the watchful eyes of the global public. She had successfully made her grand, unforgettable entrance. She had masterfully, verbally put the cruel Dahlia securely in her place. She had stood tall, proud, and unbroken next to a powerful man worth infinitely more money and respect than Julian Duval could ever dream of amassing. But the lingering pain, God, the sharp, suffocating pain of her past still clawed viciously at her throat. It wasn't really just about Julian anymore. It wasn't about Dahlia's petty, jealous insults. It was about the crushing, cumulative weight of the past 2 agonizing years finally catching up to her running feet. The profound, hollow loneliness of her exile. The deep, untreated trauma of her miscarriages. The whispered, terrifying fears she held in the dark. She was heavily pregnant, entirely alone in her own home, and standing squarely back in the unforgiving, blinding spotlight. And despite Gabriel's incredible, unwavering kindness, despite the fierce, impenetrable aura of power she had so carefully projected to the world tonight, she was absolutely terrified. Was she really emotionally strong enough for this brutal new life? Would the vicious, judgmental world ever truly let her move on in peace? Or was she just playing an elaborate, expensive game of dress-up in a luxurious life that didn't quite fit her broken soul? Her cell phone buzzed loudly on the marble counter above her head. She ignored it, burying her face in her hands. It buzzed again, vibrating against the stone. Reluctantly, wiping her wet face, she reached up and checked the bright screen. "Gabriel, I'm waiting downstairs in the car. Just in case you need anything." Chloe stared at the simple text message, feeling deeply torn. A huge, exhausted part of her desperately wanted to buzz him up, to let him into her fortress, to just lean her tired head on someone, anyone, and let them carry the weight for a night. But the other, deeply scarred part of her, the part that had been so callously abandoned, lied to, and ruthlessly discarded like trash by the man she loved, simply couldn't trust anyone fully. Not yet. Maybe not ever again. Instead, her thumbs flying over the keyboard, she typed back, "I just really need to sleep tonight. Thank you so much for absolutely everything you did tonight." He didn't respond right away. The typing bubble appeared and disappeared several times. When his reply finally came through, it read simply, "Gabriel. I'm here whenever you need me. No pressure at all. Good night, Chloe." Chloe turned off her phone screen, stripped off the heavy velvet gown, leaving it in a pile on the floor, and slipped into a warm, comfortable, oversized gray hoodie. She walked slowly down the hall and stood silently in the doorway of the nursery. It was still entirely unfinished, and she stood staring blankly at the pale, empty walls and the stacks of unopened cardboard boxes of baby clothes. She hadn't even allowed herself to pick a name for the baby yet. She hadn't let herself dare to get that far ahead in the future. Everything in her world still felt entirely too fragile to name. She finally lay down on her massive, empty bed, curled tightly onto her side, and stared blankly out the window at the distant, twinkling city lights. Sleep did not come easily to her racing mind. When it finally did drag her under, it was highly restless, feverish, and deeply cruel. She suffered through vivid, terrifying nightmares of Julian angrily throwing her out of a moving car into the freezing rain. Dahlia's shrill, mocking voice cutting her like a sharp blade. Cruel, massive newspaper headlines flashing relentlessly behind her eyelids. The ex-wife returns with a bump and a billionaire on every single television screen in the world. She woke up suddenly with a loud gasp, her chest heaving, entirely alone in the massive bed. Bright, harsh morning sunlight bled aggressively through the thick curtains. It was a brand new day, but the deep, familiar ache in her chest hadn't gone anywhere. And as she sat up in the quiet room, she finally knew with absolute certainty that it was time to brutally face herself in the mirror, before she could ever hope to face the world outside again. The quiet morning after the explosive gala, Chloe stood barefoot on the heated hardwood floors in her sleek, modern kitchen. She was holding a steaming, comforting mug of chamomile tea in both hands, staring blankly out the massive window at the breathtaking, sprawling city skyline. She hadn't slept well at all. Her exhausted, racing mind had obsessively replayed every single, excruciating second of the previous night on an endless loop, from Dahlia's venomous, insecure attacks to Julian's pale, stunned, pathetic silence. But simmering quietly right beneath the heavy exhaustion, something entirely new and electric stirred deep in her chest. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the familiar, suffocating anxiety that used to paralyze her. It was pure, unadulterated power. For 2 long, miserable years, Chloe had intentionally hidden that specific power, burying it deep down, hiding it even from herself to survive the trauma. But now she was completely, unequivocally done hiding in the shadows of other people's egos. She decisively picked up her encrypted smartphone from the counter, used her biometric thumbprint to open a highly secure, hidden folder discreetly labeled Maverick, and began to scroll. She swiped rapidly past dozens of legally sealed corporate contracts, offshore trust fund documents, and encrypted digital stock certificates. Finally, she firmly tapped on a master file simply titled, Holdings Overview C. Duval. It was her real, hidden financial portfolio. She stared hard at the glowing green numbers on the screen. It was a figure that still felt completely, wildly surreal even to her own eyes. Total net worth, $812 million US. Below the staggering number was a detailed, staggering list of her diversified global assets. She possessed 27 highly lucrative global seed investments for highly influential, silent board seats on major tech companies, 3 massive charitable foundations operating in developing nations, and a majority, controlling interest in 2 prestigious tech startup accelerators. One of those very accelerators was the exact same firm that Julian had desperately pitched his failing new product to just 6 months ago, completely, hilariously unaware that his discarded ex-wife was actually one of the anonymous, ruthless gatekeepers who had formally, flatly rejected his funding request for being unoriginal. That brutal, corporate rejection had been absolutely no accident. What most people in the gossipy high society circles didn't know, what the vicious tabloids completely missed in their lazy reporting, was that Chloe hadn't just tragically disappeared to cry into a pillow after the brutal divorce. She hadn't just evolved into a sad, broken woman. When Julian had callously left her to bleed, Chloe had collapsed emotionally, yes. But she had absolutely not collapsed financially. What arrogant, self-obsessed Julian had entirely failed to realize was that Chloe had quietly, brilliantly been investing her own consulting money and seed capital since her early university years. She wasn't gambling on volatile, flashy tech stocks or chasing empty, trendy crypto fads. She had been investing her capital securely in real people. She aggressively funded brilliant, women-led tech startups, revolutionary global education platforms, and emerging life-saving medical tech companies. She had never, ever wanted the glaring, stressful public spotlight for herself, but she possessed a once-in-a-generation, brilliant eye for recognizing hidden value in a company and relentlessly nurturing it until it bloomed into a billion-dollar unicorn. Gabrielle Lancaster had been the very first person in the world to find out her massive secret. It had happened exactly 6 months earlier, during a highly contentious, closed-door boardroom meeting at an exclusive private equity networking event in London. He was standing at the head of the table, passionately speaking to a room of older men about the future of legacy investments, when Chloe, who was attending very quietly in the back row as an anonymous consultant, politely but firmly challenged one of his major financial points. She stood up and articulated, in terrifying, exact detail, a massive, hidden flaw and a failing pattern in his firm's international portfolio that he and his team of Harvard analysts had completely failed to notice. Immediately afterward, highly intrigued and deeply impressed by her sheer brilliance, he approached her and asked to see her corporate background and resume. She simply handed him a blank, matte black business card with absolutely no job title, no corporate logo, and just a single, private, encrypted email address printed in white. Gabriel, being a man of immense resources, did his own deep dive research into her background. What his investigators found completely, utterly floored him. He discovered a brilliant woman with absolutely zero public digital footprint who had quietly, masterfully moved hundreds of millions of dollars in capital behind closed, locked doors. She had single-handedly created massive tech incubators for brilliant refugee entrepreneurs in Spain. She had fully funded revolutionary clean water systems in rural Cambodia, and she had never, not once, asked for a single shred of public credit or a magazine cover for her work. She wasn't just smart or intelligent. She was the exact, terrifying kind of brilliant that made arrogant, established billionaires incredibly nervous. That was exactly when Gabriel had approached her and offered her significantly more than just a standard business partnership. He offered her absolute protection from the media, complete, unshakable discretion, and genuine, profound professional respect. He never once pried or asked her to share her traumatic personal story. He simply waited patiently until she was fully ready to tell it on her own terms. And this morning, staring out at the sunrise over the city, Chloe was finally ready. She walked over and sat down purposefully at her massive, glass dining table. She opened her sleek laptop, logged into her secure server, and clicked send on a massive, bombshell press release she had personally drafted and saved securely in her drafts folder weeks ago, entirely unsure at the time if she would ever actually have the courage to use it. The bold subject line read, Chloe Marin Duval officially launches $100 million Women's Equity Venture Fund, backed by anonymous billionaire collective. The byline of the press release was intentionally subtle and highly understated. There was absolutely no mention of her dramatic past with Julian. There was no mention of Gabriel's name or his capital. But the sheer financial magnitude of the announcement was more than enough to detonate a bomb in the financial world. Within 2 short hours, every major global media outlet was buzzing frantically with the breaking news. Forbes, Business Insider, The Wall Street Journal, and TechCrunch all blasted the story to millions of readers. Even the notoriously stoic New York Times ran a massive front-page feature piece. The silent powerhouse returns. Chloe Duval steps out of the shadows to dominate the valley. Julian saw the breaking headline while eating a depressing, silent breakfast in his sprawling, empty corner penthouse. His panicked executive assistant rushed breathlessly into the dining room, holding his iPad out like it was a live grenade. "Sir, you really need to see this right now," the assistant stammered. Julian grabbed the iPad, scrolled quickly down the page, and completely froze in his chair. He stared in absolute, horrified shock at the high-definition photo attached to the article. It was Chloe. She was dressed impeccably in a sharp, tailored, bespoke power suit, resting one confident hand protectively on her beautiful baby bump. She was standing powerfully in front of a massive, glowing digital screen at a recent conference, with her new $100 million fund's mission statement lit up brilliantly behind her. Julian's expensive silver fork dropped from his numb fingers and clattered loudly against his porcelain plate. "What the hell is this?" he gasped, his heart pounding in his ears. Dahlia peeked her head nervously out from the hallway, still wearing her fluffy silk robe, holding a cup of coffee. "Is that breaking news about your ex again?" she asked, annoyance lacing her tone. "She was never supposed to have this kind of money," he muttered under his breath, his voice low, shaking and absolutely seething with jealous rage. "She wasn't supposed to be able to outplay me in my own industry." His cell phone buzzed violently on the table. It was an angry call from a major investor. Then another call immediately followed. Then frantic text messages from two of his senior board members. They were all angrily demanding to know the exact same thing. "Why the hell didn't you ever tell us your ex-wife was sitting on that kind of massive capital and industry power?" Julian stared blankly at the chaotic, ringing screen, his stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss as he realized the truth entirely too late. Chloe hadn't just come back to town to show off a new baby and a handsome billionaire on her arm. She had come back to casually drop the hammer and reveal her massive, unstoppable empire. Exactly 3 weeks after the dramatic, explosive gala, Chloe stood powerfully in front of the massive, gilded mirror in the luxurious penthouse dressing suite at the Conrad residences. She stood perfectly still, watching her stunning physical transformation unfold before her very eyes. Her reflection in the glass didn't just look different tonight, it looked absolute, terrifying, and final. Gone forever was the soft, unassuming, long brown hair that had once framed her sweet face in quiet, gentle, agreeable waves. In its place was a sleek, razor-sharp, jet-black bob. It was structured, severe, and cut at a harsh, dramatic angle that made her striking cheekbones pop and her strong jawline absolutely scream with authority. Her famous celebrity stylist, Claudette, took a slow step back, holding a comb, pursing her red lips in deep, genuine admiration. "This is absolutely not a simple makeover, honey," she said, her French accent thick. "This is a declaration of war." Chloe smirked, a dangerous, confident light dancing in her dark eyes. Exactly. The dress she had chosen for the evening was a breathtaking, custom-made piece by Alexander McQueen. It was a deep, rich, commanding emerald green. It featured structured, intimidating shoulder pads, a daring, high slit up the leg, and a thick, heavy silk belt that cinched tightly and perfectly just above her prominent baby bump with unapologetic, mathematical precision. There were absolutely no frilly ruffles. There were no soft, delicate pastels. There was no pathetic attempt to soften or hide the reality of her pregnancy. She wasn't hiding her immense power anymore. She was actively, aggressively dressing it for battle. The financial press had already started affectionately calling her the Velvet Billionaire in their columns after the wildly successful, explosive launch of her equity fund. Her incredible, resilient story had gone massively viral globally, but not because of the cheap, gossipy scandal of her divorce. It had gone viral because of her undeniable, sheer, brilliant strategy. She hadn't bothered to respond to a single piece of cheap tabloid gossip. She hadn't publicly mentioned Julian's name even once to the press. And she hadn't stooped to giving tearful, dramatic television interviews about her past trauma. She just silently made massive, tectonic financial moves in the dark, incredibly powerful ones. Since the shocking announcement 3 weeks ago, Chloe had personally closed 5 major, multi-million-dollar corporate deals. She had heavily invested in 2 highly promising, female-led tech startups. And in a brilliant stroke of poetic justice, she had aggressively bought back controlling shares in a massive fashion tech company, the exact same company that had callously dropped her as a brand ambassador immediately after her messy divorce went public. And tonight was highly significant. It was her very first official public reappearance in the corporate world since the dramatic night of the gala. The exclusive, highly secure event was being hosted by Bloomberg Private Wealth. It was a notoriously strict, closed-door, invite-only conference specifically designed for high-net-worth mega-investors and elite global entrepreneurs. Normally, this specific, stuffy guest list was strictly reserved for older men in boring gray suits, and a few women in muted, conservative pantsuits who knew how to play nice in the boys' club. Chloe, however, was absolutely not here to play nice. She arrived at the venue in the back of a sleek, armored black Bentley. She stepped out onto the pavement entirely without a handler or a PR rep guiding her, and she let the ravenous media cameras completely feast on her new, striking look. Photographers scrambled desperately over each other for an angle. Reporters pushed aggressively against the barricades, shouting her name, and for the very first time in years, absolutely no one in the press corps cared who Julian Duval was currently dating. The exact moment Chloe walked confidently through the revolving doors into the massive marble building, every single head in the lobby turned to stare. She glided effortlessly through the space like she personally owned the very concrete beneath her feet. And, in a very literal way, she actually did. Gabriel's firm had recently, aggressively acquired a massive, controlling financial stake in the real estate firm hosting the event. And even though Gabriel himself wasn't physically present in the room tonight, absolutely everyone in that building knew exactly who she represented and what she was capable of. She was not there as a trophy wife. She was not there as a sad side story. She was there as an undeniable, terrifying force of nature. Inside the cavernous, opulent ballroom, powerful, wealthy executives buzzed frantically in clustered corners, holding their scotch glasses tight. "Is that really her?" one CEO whispered to his partner. "She looks absolutely lethal. She is over 7 months pregnant, and she is still effortlessly shutting down entire rooms filled with billionaires." "Jesus Christ," another murmured in deep awe. Chloe didn't even flinch at the heavy stares. She didn't look around for approval. She walked directly, with terrifying purpose, toward the very first major investor she specifically needed to meet that night, Anton Bellini. He was the notoriously ruthless, incredibly elusive Italian financier globally known for only exclusively backing true, generational visionaries. He turned around slowly as she approached, his weathered expression a mask of bored neutrality, until he fully registered exactly who was walking toward him. "Miss Duval," he said smoothly, his eyes lighting up with genuine, profound respect as he extended a heavy, ringed hand. "Or, given your recent press coverage, may I perhaps call you the Phoenix?" Chloe laughed softly, a confident, melodic sound that carried over the jazz music. "You may only call me that, Anton, if you are actively planning to invest heavily in my new fund tonight." He smiled a wide, brilliant, shark-like smile. "I already instructed my team to wire the capital this morning." Their intense, highly technical financial conversation lasted exactly 11 minutes. It was precisely long enough for her to brilliantly secure his massive, decisive voting block on an upcoming, highly contested global expansion fund. By the time she politely excused herself and turned away from him, 3 other prominent, billionaire investors had already eagerly lined up behind him, desperately waiting for their turn to speak with her and pitch their ideas. The rest of the glittering, high-stakes evening unfolded perfectly, exactly like a complex, beautiful symphony she had personally, masterfully orchestrated. There was absolutely no cheap drama. There were no intrusive, disrespectful questions about her painful past or her ex-husband. There was only profound, hushed respect and the palpable, heavy aura of pure power. At one point late in the evening, a senior, highly respected journalist from the Wall Street Journal approached her cautiously near the bar, his digital voice recorder already in his hand. Miss Duval, he asked politely, if I may ask you one question on the record. What exactly changed inside of you? What specific event finally sparked this incredible, unstoppable new version of you that the world is seeing tonight? Chloe paused, tilted her sharp, black bob slightly, and looked directly into the reporter's eyes with absolute, freezing calm. Absolutely nothing changed inside of me, she replied, her voice smooth and unshakable. I simply stopped asking the world for permission to exist. That exact, iconic quote was printed in bold, black ink the very next morning. It was plastered on the front page of the journal's business section, right above the fold for the entire financial world to see. Julian saw it while aggressively scrolling through his news feed on his tablet at his kitchen island. He gasped and nearly dropped his scalding hot coffee directly into his lap. His fiancée, who was now humiliatingly downgraded in the press to his off-and-on girlfriend due to their recent explosive fights, was standing nearby in the kitchen, loudly arguing on the phone with her talent agent about a massive cosmetic endorsement deal that had just expired and dropped her. But Julian didn't hear a single word she was screaming. He was entirely too busy staring blankly, obsessively at Chloe's stunning, powerful photograph in the digital paper. She looked completely untouchable. She looked unreachable. She looked utterly, beautifully unapologetic. He suddenly, vividly remembered the very last time she had worn high black designer heels exactly like that, years ago at a stressful product launch for his company. He had made a cruel, highly condescending passing comment to her about how maternity clothes could theoretically still look somewhat sexy if she tried harder. And she had simply, silently swallowed her deep pain and smiled politely to avoid causing a scene. That polite, accommodating, weak smile was completely, permanently gone now. It had been entirely replaced with an expression of cold, forged steel. Julian leaned heavily back in his expensive chair, the horrific, crushing weight of the absolute truth finally sinking into his bones like lead. He hadn't tragically lost Chloe to Gabriel Lancaster's billions. He had lost her completely to herself. The massive Global Innovation Summit was hosted that year at the sprawling, majestic Ritz Grand Hotel in Geneva, Switzerland. It was a highly exclusive, once-a-year, massive convergence of the world's top tech CEOs, legendary global financiers, and world-class scientific innovators. The event was strictly not televised to the public, ensuring ultimate privacy. But absolutely everyone who mattered in the global economy was physically sitting in that enormous, vaulted room. Chloe stood quietly backstage in the dark, a sleek, nearly invisible communication earpiece clipped securely to her ear, listening to the frantic production manager whispering his final stage cues to the tech crew. She wore a stunning, bespoke navy blue power suit, expertly and beautifully tailored to perfectly accommodate her heavily growing belly, yet cut sharp enough at the shoulders to make absolutely every single male executive sitting in the room sit up a little straighter in their chairs. This was finally her moment. It was not just a public comeback tour. It was a brutal, total claiming of her rightful throne. Gabriel stood silently beside her in the shadows, dressed impeccably in a classic, perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit. He wasn't standing there to take any of the spotlight for himself, and he wasn't there to guide her. He was simply there to proudly witness history being made. "You are completely ready for this," he said simply, his voice a low, comforting anchor in the chaotic backstage noise. Chloe nodded once, adjusting her jacket, her eyes locked on the curtain. "I was born ready for this." On the bright, blindingly lit other side of the heavy velvet curtain, the famous event moderator was excitedly introducing the very next keynote speaker. She is a former brilliant background strategist and is now the highly successful, visionary founder of one of the most exciting, disruptive equity funds currently operating in the world today. Please give a warm welcome to Chloe Marin Duval. Thunderous, echoing applause erupted from the massive crowd. The heavy curtain parted. She stepped powerfully out onto the massive, polished stage. The brilliant theatrical lighting caught her face perfectly, illuminating her sharp features. Her high heels clicked rhythmically and aggressively across the lacquered wooden floor like loud, sharp punctuation marks in a sentence. And the massive room, completely filled to the brim with aging billionaires, cynical journalists, and a very sweaty Julian Duval, held its collective breath in awe. Julian had absolutely not expected her to be a keynote speaker here today. He was seated nervously near the very front row. With Dahlia nowhere in sight, she had flown back to LA after another fight. He was flanked on either side by the anxious board members of his very latest, desperate venture, HyperLens. It was an ambitious but failing tech startup that was desperately seeking a massive influx of funding today after its last major consumer product had flopped horribly in the global market. Chloe reached the clear lucite podium, adjusted the microphone, glanced slowly out at the massive sea of tailored, expensive suits and flashy gold Rolex watches, and smiled a dangerous, brilliant smile. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice echoing with absolute, crystal-clear authority. "Let's have a real conversation today. Let's talk about power, real systemic power." For the next 15 grueling, spectacular minutes, she delivered a keynote address so incredibly precise, so intellectually devastating, and so surgical in its profound economic insight, that the strict event moderators completely forgot to flash the red light to cut her off at her time limit. She spoke eloquently and brutally about hidden corporate equity, psychological market manipulation, and the inherently flawed nature of inflated startup valuations. She exposed exactly how brilliant female founders were constantly, systematically undercapitalized and ignored by wealthy men who loudly claimed on Twitter to champion diversity, while secretly, ruthlessly gatekeeping financial opportunity in private boardrooms. She didn't specifically name Julian in her speech. She didn't have to utter his name for the execution to be flawless. At one highly critical point in her presentation, she referenced a specific, anonymous case study about certain arrogant tech companies that aggressively used image-based AR software to illegally manipulate consumer tracking data for profit. It was the exact, highly illegal tech scheme that Julian's company had been brutally exposed by journalists for misusing in the last financial quarter. Loud, shocked gasps rippled clearly through the front rows. Julian stiffened so hard his spine popped. Then, she coolly clicked the remote in her hand to change the massive slide on the screen behind her. Behind her appeared a massive, undeniable graphic timeline, clearly showing exactly how Chloe's new equity fund had heavily invested millions in a direct, competing AR tech company. The graph showed that her chosen company had utterly, spectacularly outperformed Julian's failing company by a staggering 87% in profit margins since their respective launches. She paused, letting the devastating numbers sink in, and then looked directly down from the stage into Julian's terrified, pale eyes. "We do not waste our capital betting on immature boys playing with expensive toys," she said, her voice ringing like a final verdict. "We exclusively invest in true builders." The entire room erupted into wild, deafening applause and cheers. A few rows directly behind Julian's seat, a prominent venture capitalist whispered loudly to his partner, "That's his ex-wife up there, right? Damn, he is so screwed." Julian's throat tightened in pure, unadulterated panic. He looked desperately to his left and right at his executive team, two of whom were now looking at each other with deep, terrified uncertainty about their impending bankruptcy. When Chloe finally finished her speech and confidently left the stage, the entire energy of the global summit shifted permanently. Absolutely no one in the hallways was talking about investing in HyperLens anymore. They were all exclusively talking about wanting to do business with Chloe. Outside the Grand Hotel doors, the aggressive global press had already instantly picked up the viral story. Chloe Duval utterly destroys tech industry bias in 15 minutes flat was currently the #1 trending topic globally on X. High-definition photos of her stunning side profile on stage, looking incredibly fierce, pregnant, and graceful. Spread across the internet like a beautiful wildfire. Julian practically sprinted, ducking out the back service exit of the ballroom like a coward, furiously ignoring the relentless, buzzing calls from his panicked PR rep. He desperately needed fresh air. Instead of an empty alley, he found Gabriel Lancaster standing quietly, imposing and tall, waiting near the VIP valet stand. "Leaving so soon, Julian?" Gabriel asked, his deep voice smooth but carrying a lethal, mocking edge. Julian clenched his jaw, his fists shaking with impotent rage. "Enjoying this humiliating circus, huh? Is this what you paid for?" Gabriel's smile was incredibly polite, highly measured, and terrifyingly cold. "I absolutely did not come here today for cheap revenge against you, Julian." "No." Julian spat defensively. "Then what the hell do you want from me?" Gabriel's dark gaze sharpened into pure, unyielding steel, stepping closer until he towered over Julian. "I want Chloe to never, ever have to explain herself or her brilliance to a small man like you ever again. I want arrogant, empty people exactly like you to permanently stop mistaking a woman's quiet grace for weakness. And most importantly, I want you to know, deep in your soul, that you did not lose her to my money. You lost her entirely on your own, the exact moment you foolishly stopped seeing her worth." Julian didn't respond. He couldn't. There was absolutely nothing left in his hollow life to say. By the time Chloe stepped triumphantly outside the front doors to meet Gabriel, hundreds of photographers swarmed the barricades and blinding flashes popped like strobe lights. She stood proudly beside Gabriel, glowing, radiant, and completely unfazed by the chaos. One bold reporter shoved a microphone forward and shouted, "Miss Duval, do you have any specific comment on the future of Mr. Duval's company after your devastating presentation at today's summit?" Chloe paused, turning slightly toward the cameras with a serene, pitying smile. "I sincerely hope he manages to innovate something much better next time around," she said smoothly. "We all grow up and mature at our own pace." Click, click, click. The stunning, high-definition shot of her and Gabriel turning their backs and walking gracefully away hand in hand, completely ignoring the noise, instantly became the most iconic, widely shared image of the entire year. Julian, standing alone in the freezing shadows watching from a distance, knew exactly what that photo meant for his future. She hadn't just moved on from his life. She had entirely, permanently leveled up into a stratosphere he could never reach. 2 beautiful, quiet months later, Chloe sat peacefully on the sprawling, sun-drenched wooden balcony of her massive Santa Barbara estate. The stunning, sparkling blue Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before her, with soft, rhythmic waves breaking gently against the jagged cliffs far below. She wasn't just finally living in profound peace. She had fiercely, brutally earned every single second of it. Her beautiful, healthy baby boy, Ezra Marin Duval, slept quietly and safely in the expensive wicker bassinet right beside her chair, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket. Gabriel was inside the massive, airy kitchen, humming a tune and happily cooking breakfast. Yes, to her daily amusement, the intimidating, ruthless billionaire actually knew exactly how to make perfect, cinnamon-dusted French toast. The warm, golden California sun had just begun its lazy, beautiful climb across the morning sky. But sitting there in the warmth, Chloe wasn't thinking about her massive bank accounts, her thriving equity funds, or her recent global media dominance. She was thinking deeply about the future and about her lasting legacy. The past grueling, traumatic year had completely and utterly rewritten the entire trajectory of her life. She had gone from bravely walking into that hostile gala as a targeted symbol of high society scandal, to confidently standing on massive international stages, actively rewriting the global corporate narrative about female power, gender equity, and what it truly means to come back 10 times stronger after being broken. Her private email inbox was now overflowing daily with thousands of heartbreaking, beautiful stories from women all over the world. Female entrepreneurs, struggling single moms, brave cancer survivors, exhausted caretakers, women who had been brutally silenced, betrayed, dismissed, and discarded by society. They weren't just mildly inspired by her viral keynote speech. They were fiercely, deeply activated to change their own lives. And today, sitting in the morning sun, Chloe was finally ready to speak her ultimate truth. Not through dry corporate investment reports, not through splashy PR-driven fund launches, but directly, heart to heart, to the women who needed to hear it most. She opened her silver laptop, took a deep breath of ocean air, and began to type. An open letter, from one healing woman, to absolutely every other woman in the world who has ever been brutally underestimated. To the brave girl who stayed completely silent just to keep the peace in a toxic home. To the exhausted woman who kept showing up to work and fighting, even when absolutely no one clapped for her efforts. To the struggling mother, the loving daughter, the bruised survivor, and the relentless dreamer. This message is entirely for you. You do not ever have to explain to anyone why you stayed in the dark, or why you finally found the courage to leave, or why the pressure finally broke you. You do not ever have to apologize to the world for healing slowly on your own timeline. You do not have to apologize for loving someone too hard, or for foolishly believing in someone who never, ever truly believed in you. I once deeply loved a man who cruelly told me I was far too emotional to ever be taken seriously in the real world. A man who sneered and said my gentle softness made me pathetically fragile. A man who whispered sweet lies that I was his grounding anchor. Right up until the day he decided to see me as disposable dead weight, holding him back from his shallow dreams. I once tragically lost absolutely everything I mistakenly thought made me valuable as a human being. My marriage, my social title, my direction in life. I broke completely into a million tiny pieces, very quietly in the dark. But I chose to rebuild myself very, very loudly. I didn't rebuild with toxic, petty revenge in my heart, but with a crystal clear, unshakable vision for my future. I took my resources and I invested in brilliant women who had absolutely nothing in their pockets but massive dreams. I poured all of my agonizing pain directly into my newfound purpose. I absolutely stopped shrinking my personality to fit into small, suffocating rooms that were clearly not built for my spirit. And when I finally proudly walked back into those exact same rooms, I made them mine. So, here is what I desperately want you to know today. You are not small. You are not a burden, and you are not inconvenient. You are absolutely never too much for the right people. Your deep, painful scars do not make you a broken, ruined thing. They make you absolute, undeniable proof. Proof that you survived the fire, that you endured the nightmare, that you outlived your enemies, and that you bravely chose to rise up when the entire world placed bets on your tragic fall. Let them talk behind your back. Let them gossip in the shadows. Underestimate your brilliance, and roll their eyes at your ambition. Then, let them watch you succeed. Because someday very soon, you will confidently walk into a massive, beautiful room that they cruelly told you would never, ever deserve to enter. And they will have to nervously adjust their tone of voice just to speak your name. And when that glorious, inevitable day finally comes, just smile. Not because they finally validation LIC you, but simply because you realize you never actually needed them to. With all my love and solidarity, Chloe Marin Duval. She took a deep breath, looked at the sleeping baby, and firmly hit publish on her social media platforms. Within 30 minutes, the deeply emotional, empowering post had gone massively, globally viral. Famous celebrities tearfully reposted it to millions of followers. Powerful female politicians quoted it in their morning speeches. Countless women from absolutely every industry and background stitched their own painful, triumphant stories to hers in the comments, weaving them together like beautiful, unbreakable threads in a massive, global tapestry of sisterhood. And Julian? He read the viral post in absolute, crushing silence. Sitting completely alone in the dark living room of an expensive, empty Malibu rental house he could barely afford anymore. He didn't try to call her. He didn't attempt to write a pathetic apology email. He didn't dare try to interrupt the profound, beautiful peace she had so masterfully built without him. He just sat there in the dark, reading the powerful words of the brilliant woman he had once stupidly labeled as too soft, and finally, painfully understood that he had never, ever really known her at all. Back on the sunlit balcony in Santa Barbara, Chloe closed her silver laptop with a satisfying click and gently lifted her waking baby from the bassinet. She held little Ezra close to her chest, breathing in his sweet scent, and pressed a long, loving kiss to his tiny, warm forehead. "You will never, ever have to ask this world for permission to exist," she whispered fiercely into his soft hair. "You will simply inherit it." Gabriel stepped out onto the breezy balcony, wearing casual linen pants, handing her a warm plate of golden, syrup-drenched French toast and offering a soft, incredibly loving smile that reached his dark eyes. "Are you entirely ready for your next big board meeting, Miss Duval?" He teased her gently, wrapping his free arm around her waist. Chloe grinned, leaning her head happily against his broad shoulder, looking out at the endless, glittering horizon. "Always," she replied, because she knew with absolute, joyful certainty that this beautiful morning wasn't her ending. This was only her brilliant, unstoppable beginning. So, the incredible story has finally ended. Our wonderful friends, are you still sitting here right now, reading or listening to these final, closing words? If you are still here, then maybe, just maybe, something deep in Chloe's harrowing, triumphant journey stirred something powerful and dormant inside your own heart. Maybe you resonated with the heavy, agonizing pain she carried so silently and bravely in the dark. Maybe it was that empowering, electric moment when she finally, fiercely chose not to shrink herself for the comfort of others anymore. Or maybe it is the profound, beautiful hope that even when absolutely everything in your life completely falls apart and burns to the ground, you can still rise from the ashes, louder, wiser, and infinitely more powerful than you ever were before. Because the absolute truth is, this wasn't just a dramatic story about an arrogant ex-husband, an insecure beauty queen, or a wealthy billionaire. This was fundamentally a story about boldly reclaiming your stolen voice. It is about bravely rewriting the cruel, limiting script that other, smaller people tried to aggressively write for you. It is about the quiet, unyielding, terrifying resilience of women everywhere who have been systematically silenced, brutally sidelined, and constantly underestimated by society. As Chloe beautifully showed us, possessing a soft, gentle heart does absolutely not mean you are weak. And being underestimated by the people around you, that is not an insult to your character. It is simply the universe giving you the perfect, brilliant setup for a stunning, jaw-dropping comeback. Maybe you have been exactly where Chloe was, feeling completely abandoned, callously dismissed, and forced to watch from the sidelines as someone else cruelly stole your rightful spotlight. And maybe, in your darkest moments, you have looked in the mirror and tearfully wondered, is this it? Is this tragedy all I am ever going to be? But please listen to the truth that actually matters. You are absolutely not broken. You are simply in the painful, beautiful process of becoming. The harsh world has a very insidious way of making strong women feel like they need to constantly apologize for absolutely everything about themselves. They tell you that you are too loud, or too quiet, or too emotional, or far too ambitious for your own good. But what if the exact thing they call too much is exactly the very thing this broken world desperately needs more of? Chloe's incredible journey reminds us all that you absolutely do not have to beg on your knees to be seen or respected. You do not have to painfully shrink your vibrant soul to fit into someone else's tiny box of comfort. You have the power to build your own empire. You can lead with grace. You can bravely walk away from the very things and people that deeply hurt you, and walk confidently right into the beautiful life that heals you. There is one profound, brilliant line from heterodox philosophy that I constantly keep returning to when life gets hard. It is this: we heal not when we desperately try to return to the exact place or person that broke us, but when we bravely choose to build a new life on the very ground where we were burned. And Chloe, she didn't just quietly rebuild her old life. She brilliantly created a massive, untouchable empire entirely from her own ashes. So, if you are reading or watching this right now, if you have ever felt incredibly small, completely invisible, or forcefully silenced by the people around you, let this be your ultimate, undeniable call to action. This is your sign to rise up, to speak your truth loudly, to build your own dreams, and to choose yourself fully, without a single ounce of apology. If Chloe's incredible story of resilience and triumph moved you, even just a little bit, please drop a comment below and tell us exactly which powerful moment in the story hit your heart the hardest. Please like this video if you truly, deeply believe in the beautiful power of second chances. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, because every single week we are here to bring you amazing, empowering stories that remind you exactly how powerful and transformative true healing can be. Remember, you are absolutely never alone in your struggles. And your beautiful, triumphant story, it is just beginning. See you next time.